The estate had no official name on any map. Those who knew of it called it simply the Hargrove property, spoken in the hushed, slightly reverent tone that people reserve for places they've heard of but will never see. It occupied 43 acres in the hills above the city, invisible from every road, announced only by a pair of iron gates so tall they seemed designed to make visitors feel small before they'd even arrived. Sarah Hargrove had lived inside those gates for all 22 years of her life. She was standing at her bedroom window when the morning began, the same window where she spent more time than she would ever admit to anyone. 3 floors up, facing east, with a view that swept past the manicured gardens and the hedge labyrinth and the reflecting pool, and finally, just barely, to the distant shimmer of the city below. On clear days she could see cars moving on the freeway, tiny and silent from this distance, like toys someone had forgotten to put away. She pressed one finger to the glass. The city didn't press back. The Hargrove estate was, by any objective measure, a masterpiece of private excess. The main house contained 31 rooms, a private cinema, a wine cellar that functioned as its own climate-controlled museum, a gymnasium that professional athletes would have envied, and a library housing over 12,000 volumes, many of them first editions that had never once been opened. The grounds included 2 pools, 1 indoor, 1 outdoor, a tennis court, a greenhouse the size of a small school, and a garage containing 14 vehicles, all of them maintained to showroom condition regardless of whether they were ever driven. Sarah had ridden in 8 of them. She had never once chosen the destination. Breakfast arrived at 8:15 precisely, as it always did, a silver tray carried by Marta, who had worked in the estate's kitchen for 19 years and who hummed the same 3 songs in rotation, always in the same order, as though her mornings ran on a private soundtrack. Poached eggs, sourdough from the estate's own bakery, a glass of cold-pressed juice whose ingredients had been selected that week by a nutritionist in Switzerland. "Your father asks if you'll join him for lunch today," Marta said, setting the tray on the table near the window without looking at what Sarah was looking at. Marta never looked at the window. Sarah had noticed this years ago. The staff, almost universally, avoided facing the direction of the city. Whether this was deliberate or simply habit, she had never been able to determine. "Tell him yes," Sarah said. Marta nodded and left without another word. Elliot Hargrove occupied a different kind of space than other people. This was something Sarah had always understood instinctively, even as a child, that her father didn't simply walk into rooms but claimed them. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the particular physical confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the world would accommodate him, because it always had. His suits were bespoke, his handshake legendary in certain financial circles, his name attached to buildings, hospitals, and institutions on 4 continents. He was also, to Sarah's knowledge, the loneliest person she had ever known. Lunch was served on the East Terrace, the same terrace where, as a small child, Sarah had once watched her father stand completely still for 11 minutes after receiving a phone call, staring at nothing, while his food grew cold and his assistant waited at a careful distance, too frightened to interrupt whatever was happening inside him. Today he seemed composed. The mask was well fitted, as it usually was. "I spoke with the Geneva office this morning," he said, cutting into his food without looking up. "The acquisition is moving forward ahead of schedule." "That's good," Sarah said. "It's significant. 17,000 employees. In 6 countries will report to us by the end of next quarter." He paused. "Power isn't loud, Seraphina. It accumulates quietly, and by the time others notice, it's too late for them to respond." She had heard variations of this her entire life. "Father," she said, carefully, "I've been thinking about the university program again. The one in." No. The word wasn't harsh. It never was. It was simply final, the kind of word that didn't open doors but sealed them. "The proposal was thorough," she continued. "Dr. Pemberton said my academic record would qualify me for Dr. Pemberton works for me." He looked up then, and his eyes held the expression she had no word for, something that was not cruelty but was not kindness either. Something older and more complicated. "The world outside is not what you imagine it to be, Seraphina. I have seen what it does to people. What it does to trust. What it does to people who believe they can simply walk into it unprepared." He meant her mother. He always meant her mother, even when he never said her name. "Eat your lunch," he said. Her name had been Elena. That was all Sarah knew for certain. Elena Hargrove, née Vasquez, had been 26 years old when she married Elliot and 28 when she disappeared from the estate one autumn morning without a note, without a phone call, without any explanation that anyone including, apparently, Elliot himself had ever received or been willing to share. Sarah had been 3 years old. She had no memory of her mother's face that hadn't come from photographs, and there were fewer of those than you might expect in a house this size. The ones that remained were small, tucked into corners. A single framed image in the library showing Elena laughing at something outside the frame, her head tilted, her hair loose. A portrait in Elliot's private office that Sarah had seen only once, briefly, through a door left accidentally open. She had stood in that hallway for a long time. The woman in the portrait had Sarah's eyes. Nobody in the household spoke about Elena Hargrove. This was not a rule that had ever been stated. It was simply a weight that pressed down on any conversation that wandered too close to the subject, redirecting it gently but firmly elsewhere. The staff had learned it. Sarah had learned it. But learning not to speak about something is not the same as learning not to think about it. She found the photograph by accident. She had been looking for a specific book in the library, a volume on landscape architecture that one of her tutors had referenced, and in pulling it from the shelf had dislodged a thin envelope that had apparently been slipped behind it at some point in the distant past. Inside was a single photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed her mother standing on a street Sarah didn't recognize. Not the estate, not any private event. A real street, somewhere in the city, crowded with ordinary people in ordinary clothes. Elena was facing away from the camera, but her posture was unmistakable, the particular way she tilted her head that Sarah recognized from the library portrait. She was giving money to a man sitting on the pavement, not handing it to him. Crouching down, at his level, looking at his face. The folded paper contained 4 lines of handwriting Sarah didn't recognize. They told me you'd stop coming. I wanted you to know that what you did for us mattered. It still matters. I hope wherever you are, you know that. No signature. No date. Sarah stared at the words for a long time. Most people would have put it back. She didn't put it back. The plan had been forming for months, the way that desperate things always form, slowly at first, then all at once. She had mapped the security rotations. Identified the one window in the eastern garden wall where the camera had been angled poorly after a maintenance crew adjusted it 2 years ago and never corrected it. Noted that Thursday evenings, when her father held his standing dinner with the board of directors in the main dining room, were the one predictable gap in the household's attention. The city clothes she had ordered online through an account she'd opened quietly 6 months ago, using a proxy she'd spent weeks researching, paying in a way that couldn't be traced back to her name. Plain jeans, a plain jacket, ordinary shoes, nothing that announced money, nothing that announced anything at all. She'd practiced wearing them in her room. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. The Thursday came like any other. She ate dinner in her room, claimed a headache, which Marta accepted without question, and waited until the sounds of the formal dining room drifted up through the house, the low rumble of male conversation and the clink of expensive crystal. She went down the east stairs, through the garden, through the gap in the wall, and for the first time in her 22 years of living, Seraphina Hargrove stepped onto a street that didn't belong to her father. The city hit her like a physical thing. The sound of it first layered and alive in a way she hadn't anticipated, the way a recording of rain is nothing like actual rain. Engines and voices and distant music, and somewhere above her a siren that faded as quickly as it appeared. The air smelled different out here. Warmer, more complicated. She walked. She didn't know where she was going. She had a map on her phone and money in her jacket pocket and a pounding in her chest that was either terror or joy, and she couldn't yet tell the difference. She had been told her whole life what she would find out here. Danger, selfishness, people who would see her wealth or the potential of it and act accordingly. A world that operated on transaction and distrust. A world that had wounded her father so severely that he had built 43 acres of barrier between himself and it. She walked for 20 minutes before she saw it. At first she wasn't sure she was seeing it correctly. An older woman, 60, perhaps older, carrying 2 heavy shopping bags had stepped off the curb, and one of the bags had split, sending cans and boxes spilling across the road. A car horn sounded. The woman froze. And then, 4 people stopped. Not 1, 4. Strangers. A young man in work clothes. A teenage girl with headphones around her neck. A woman in a business suit who didn't even break stride before she was crouching down. An elderly man moving slowly but moving, reaching for a tin of tomatoes that had rolled toward the gutter. They gathered everything. They handed it back. The young man in work clothes transferred the remaining items into his own backpack and walked the woman to her building 3 doors down, and when she tried to give him something, money, maybe, or a phone number, he shook his head and said something that made her laugh, and then he walked away alone. He didn't look back to see if anyone had noticed. No one was watching. No one was filming. There was no reason on earth to do what he had just done except that a stranger needed help. Sarah stood on the pavement and felt something happen inside her chest that she had no word for. Everything she had been taught said this wasn't real. Everything she was feeling said she had just watched the most real thing she had ever seen in her life. She pulled the folded note from her jacket pocket. She'd been carrying it since the library and looked again at the handwriting. What you did for us mattered. Her mother had come here. Her mother had stood on streets like this one. And whatever the truth was about Elena Hargrove's disappearance, Sarah was suddenly, absolutely certain of one thing. Her father had never told her all of it. She stayed out for 3 hours. 3 hours and 14 minutes, to be exact. She knew because she checked her phone when she finally slipped back through the gap in the garden wall. Her heart still loud in her ears, her ordinary shoes dusty from pavements that had never been pressure washed or privately maintained. The house was quiet. The board dinner had ended. The lights in her father's study burned amber behind drawn curtains, which meant he was still awake, which meant she needed to be invisible. She was very good at being invisible. She had been practicing her whole life. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed without turning on the lamp and replayed everything she had seen. The woman with the split bag. The 4 strangers. The young man walking away without looking back. Small moments, maybe, by any external measure. The kind of thing that happened on city streets 1,000 times a day, unrecorded and unremarked upon. But Sarah had been raised in a house where kindness was explained away before it could take root. They want something. They're performing. People only act generous when someone is watching. She had believed this. She had believed it the way you believe things that are handed to you before you're old enough to question them, not because they've been proven, but because the person handing them to you is the entire world you know. She looked at the folded note again. What you did for us mattered. Who had written it? How had it ended up behind a book in a library that no one except Sarah ever used? And why, after 19 years, did it feel less like a discarded letter and more like a message that had been waiting? She didn't sleep until nearly dawn. Thursday became a ritual. For the next 4 weeks, Sarah slipped out through the eastern wall every Thursday evening and walked the city for exactly 3 hours. She was methodical about it the way she was methodical about everything, charting a slightly different route each time, extending her radius, learning the geography of a world she had previously known only as a distant shimmer. She learned things that no tutor had ever taught her. She learned that the bakery on Crescent Street put unsold loaves outside in a crate at 8 p.m. with a handwritten sign that said "Take what you need," and that people did, and that nobody took more than they needed. She learned that the man who ran the newsstand on the corner of Alderton and 5th knew the names of every regular customer and asked after their families with what was unmistakably genuine interest. She learned that the neighborhood around the old textile building, the one her father's company had purchased 2 years ago and left empty while zoning negotiations dragged on, had once had a community garden on the vacant lot next door, and that the garden was gone now, and that the people who had tended it still walked past the chain-link fence, sometimes with expressions she had no comfortable word for. She filed all of this away. She didn't know yet what she was building. The 5th Thursday was when everything changed. She had walked further east than usual, into a neighborhood where the architecture shifted from renovated brownstone to older buildings with fire escapes that looked decorative rather than functional, and corner shops whose signs were hand-lettered. The evening light was going amber and the air smelled like someone nearby was grilling something, and Sarah was so absorbed in watching a group of children play an elaborate chalk game on the pavement that she didn't notice the woman until she had almost walked into her. Sorry. Sarah stepped back. The woman looked at her steadily. She was perhaps 40, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples and paint-stained fingers and the particular quality of stillness that some people carry like a second skin. She was sitting on the steps of what appeared to be a converted storefront, its windows covered from the inside with brown paper. "You're not from around here," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I'm just walking. People don't usually walk this far east unless they're going somewhere specific." She tilted her head. "Or running away from something." Sarah opened her mouth to deflect. She had prepared deflections for exactly this kind of moment and then, inexplicably, didn't use any of them. Maybe both, she said. The woman looked at her for another moment, then moved slightly on the step. An invitation, or at least the shape of one. Her name was Dara. She had been an architect before, she explained without elaborating on what before meant, and now she ran a community arts space out of the converted storefront after school programs, adult education classes, a small gallery that mounted shows by local artists who couldn't afford the downtown spaces. "We're being evicted," she said, with a matter-of-factness that was somehow more devastating than distress would have been. Building was sold. New owners want it cleared by end of next month. Where will you go? That's the question, isn't it? She didn't say it bitterly. She said it the way you acknowledge a difficult truth that you've been sitting with long enough that the edges have worn smooth. 63 kids come through here every week after school. 14 adult learners in the evening literacy program. 6 artists who use the studio space. She paused. They'll all find something else eventually. People do. But eventually is a long time when you're 8 years old and the only safe place you know disappears. Sarah thought about the empty lot next to the textile building. The chain-link fence. The people who still walked past it. She thought about her father's signature on acquisition documents she had once seen on his desk, pages and pages of them. Properties and companies and holdings. Each one a number in a portfolio and nothing more. "What's the name of the company that bought the building?" she asked. Dara told her. It was one of her father's subsidiaries. She almost didn't go back the following Thursday. For 6 days she sat with what she knew or thought she knew and turned it over and over looking for an alternate explanation. The way you probe a sore tooth with your tongue, not because you want it to hurt but because you need to know the shape of the damage. A subsidiary. Not her father directly. These things were complicated. Property portfolios were managed by teams of people making decisions that never reached the top of the organization. She knew this was probably true. She also knew it wasn't the whole truth. Few could have predicted what she did next. She went back, and she brought something with her. It was a check. Not a large one, not by Hargrove standards. $50,000, drawn from the personal account she'd maintained since her 18th birthday. The one whose existence her father was aware of and whose balance he considered negligible. Enough to fund 6 months of rent for the storefront. Perhaps more, if Dara negotiated well. She held it out on the steps where they'd first spoken. Dara looked at it for a long time without touching it. "I'm not a charity case," she said finally. "I know. I don't know who you are. I know that too." Sarah kept her hand extended. "I know what it's like to be in a place that feels like the only real thing, and then have someone decide it doesn't matter. I know what it's like when that decision is made by someone who never once set foot inside it." Something shifted in Dara's expression. She took the check. "You're going to want to know how it gets used," she said. "I'd trust you." The words came out before Sarah had consciously decided to say them. She stood there for a moment, slightly surprised by herself. "I'd trust you." Her father's voice in her memory. Trust is a door you leave open for people to walk through and take what isn't theirs. And yet, the evening literacy class was still running when Sarah left. Through the brown-papered windows she could see the warm yellow light inside, and hear faintly the sound of someone reading aloud, slowly and carefully, sounding out words with the particular concentration of a person who has decided, at whatever age and whatever cost, that it is not too late. She walked home a different way than usual. She was passing the mouth of an alley near the old textile building when she heard a sharp, low exchange of voices. 2 of them, neither friendly. She stopped. In the narrow gap between buildings, a teenage boy 15, maybe 16, backpack on, the kind of face that was trying hard to look unbothered, was being cornered by a man twice his size. The man's hand was extended, palm up, in the unmistakable grammar of demand. The boy was shaking his head. The man took a step closer. Sarah looked up and down the street. It was nearly empty. The few people visible were moving with the particular eyes-forward determination of people who had learned, in this neighborhood, when not to see things. She thought about what her father would say. "Walk away. This is not your world. This is exactly what I warned you about." She thought about the young man with the work clothes. The woman in the business suit. 4 strangers who stopped because a person needed help. She pulled out her phone and walked directly toward the alley mouth. "There you are," she said loudly, addressing the boy with the total conviction of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment, which she absolutely had not. "I've been looking everywhere. Your mum called the center, she's waiting." The man looked at her. She looked back with an expression she had learned, over 22 years of watching her father, was more effective than any threat, the look of someone who finds you slightly boring and not at all frightening. It lasted 4 seconds. The man left. The boy stared at her. "I don't have a mom," he said. "I know. I'm sorry." She exhaled. "Are you all right?" He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the particular pride of someone who needs help and has been taught that needing help is a kind of defeat. "I'm fine," he said. "Okay." She didn't push. "I'm Sarah." He studied her for a moment. Marcus. He was, she would later learn, 16 years old. He attended the school 2 blocks from Dara's art space and had been in the after-school program until it lost its funding 8 months ago, and he'd had nowhere to go between 3 and 6 p.m. Except streets that were, at certain hours, not entirely safe. He didn't tell her any of this that night. That night he just looked at her with those careful, evaluating eyes and said, "Why did you do that?" And Sarah, who had been asking herself a version of that question for weeks, said the only honest thing she could, because someone needed help. "And I was there." Marcus nodded slowly, like he was filing it away. Like it was information that cost him something to receive. She was 1 block from the estate wall when her phone lit up. A message from a number she didn't recognize. 7 words: "I know who you are, Seraphina Hargrove." She stopped walking. Her blood went cold in the particular way it does when you realize that something you believed was private has never been private at all. She looked up at the estate wall ahead of her. The iron gates visible further along. The amber light in her father's study window, burning the same as always. A second message arrived. "Your mother wants you to know she's been watching." The phone shook in her hand. Or her hand was shaking. She couldn't tell anymore. She stood on the pavement for a long time. The phone screen dimmed, then went dark, then dimmed again as she touched it without meaning to. The street around her had gone quiet in the way that city streets go quiet late at night, not silent, never truly silent, but reduced to its essential sounds. A distant engine, wind through a gap between buildings. Somewhere above her, a window being closed against the cold. "Your mother wants you to know she's been watching." Sarah read it again, then a third time. Then she did the thing that surprised even herself. She didn't panic. Some deep internal mechanism, the same one that had planned 4 weeks of careful Thursday escapes, that had faced down a stranger in an alley with borrowed confidence, engaged quietly and said, "Think." Someone knew her name. Someone had her number, which was unlisted and registered to the proxy account she'd constructed carefully over months. Someone had connected her, standing on an ordinary street in ordinary clothes, to the name Hargrove. And that someone claimed to have a message from a woman who had been missing for 19 years. She typed back 1 word. "Prove it." The response came in under a minute. A photograph. Small and slightly blurred, taken on what looked like an older phone. A woman sitting at a table in what appeared to be a modest kitchen, tiled walls, a window with thin curtains, a coffee cup with a small chip in the rim. The woman was looking not at the camera but slightly past it, the way people look when they don't know they're being photographed or have forgotten to care. She had Sarah's eyes. The message that followed contained an address and a time. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. she'll be there. Come alone. If you bring security, she leaves." Sarah stood in her room that night and understood, for the first time in her life, what it felt like to hold something so significant that your hands don't feel like your own hands anymore. She had spent 22 years constructing a version of her mother from fragments of photograph in a library, a portrait glimpsed through an open door, 4 lines of handwriting on a folded note. Now the fragment was asking to become whole. And she had approximately 8 hours to decide whether she was brave enough to let it. The address was a community health clinic 40 minutes from the estate. Not a private facility. Not anywhere that appeared in the constellation of exclusive institutions her father's world orbited. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on a street lined with small businesses, and it had a hand-painted mural across its exterior wall, figures in blues and greens. Hands extended toward each other across a painted sky that someone had clearly made with great care and very little money. Sarah arrived 7 minutes early and sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room, wearing her plain jacket, watching a ceiling fan turn slowly overhead. At 9:03, a door opened. Elena Vasquez, she had returned, years ago, to her birth name, was 51 years old and looked like someone who had learned, through long practice, to carry difficult things without letting them bow her spine. She was smaller than the portrait suggested. Her hair was shorter. There were lines in her face that hadn't existed in any photograph Sarah had ever found. But the eyes were unmistakable, the same shape, the same particular quality of attention, like someone who is always listening for something beneath what's being said. They sat across from each other at a small table in a back office the clinic director had quietly made available. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I rehearsed this," Elena said finally. Her voice was low and slightly unsteady. "I had it planned. What I'd say, how I'd explain." She paused. "It all left when I saw your face." "Then just tell me the truth," Sarah said. "Whatever it is." Elena looked at her for another moment. And then she did. The truth was this. 20 years ago, Elena Hargrove had discovered something about her husband's business, a specific acquisition, a specific set of decisions made in a specific emerging market. Decisions that had displaced several hundred families from land they'd occupied for generations to make way for a development that had ultimately never been built. The paperwork was buried in subsidiaries of subsidiaries. The families had received settlements that were, by any honest measure, insulting. And when Elena had confronted Elliot, not publicly, not threateningly, but privately, as his wife, asking him to make it right, he had told her, calmly and with complete certainty, that this was how the world worked, that sentiment was not a business strategy, and that she needed to understand where her life actually existed and where it did not. She had not accepted this. She had spent the following months quietly compiling documentation, connecting with advocacy organizations, building, carefully, towards something she believed would force a correction that Elliot's conscience had declined to provide. He found out before she was ready. What followed was not dramatic in the way that stories usually require. There was no single terrible confrontation. What happened instead was quieter and, in certain ways, worse. Elliot made clear through lawyers, through the architecture of their financial arrangement, through the precise application of the power he had spent decades accumulating, that if Elena proceeded, she would have nothing. Not money. Not credibility. And, he implied without quite stating directly, not Sarah. She had believed him. That was the part she said with the most difficulty, the part where her voice finally did what it had been threatening to do throughout. "I believed he would take you from me," she said. "I was 29 years old and I had no money that wasn't his and no platform that wasn't constructed by his name, and I was terrified. So I made the worst decision of my life." She had left. Quietly, completely, in a way that gave Elliot the narrative he then used: abandonment, betrayal, the wound that justified every wall he subsequently built. "I told myself it was temporary," she said. "I told myself I'd find a way back. A legal way. Something that couldn't be used against me. It took 20 years, Sarah said. It took 20 years. Elena didn't flinch from it. "I am not asking you to forgive that. I want you to understand it, and whether forgiveness comes after that or doesn't, that's yours. I won't ask you for it." Sarah sat with this. The ceiling fan turned overhead. From the waiting room beyond the door came the ordinary sounds of a clinic doing its ordinary work: a child's voice, a receptionist's phone, the particular ambient sound of a place where people came when they needed help and found it. "The note," Sarah said. "The one in the library. Behind the book." Elena's expression shifted. "You found it. It was about you. Someone thanking you for something." "I used to come into the city," Elena said. "Before everything fell apart. I ran a small informal fund, nothing official, nothing that was connected to Elliot's name, just money I carved out from my own accounts over years. Health services, emergency housing, small things." She paused. "The note was from a man named Gerald. His family had been in crisis housing and I'd helped cover some costs. I don't know how it ended up in the library." Sarah thought about the photograph, her mother crouching on a street, at a stranger's level, looking at their face. She thought about Dara and her 63 children and the check that had surprised even the person writing it. She thought about Marcus in the alley mouth, and the literacy class, and the voice reading carefully in yellow light. Like mother, like daughter. The decision seemed small when she'd first slipped that check from her pocket. She understood now that it hadn't been small at all. She drove back to the estate, had the car brought around, one of the 14, which felt strange and normal in equal measure, and sat for 20 minutes in the vehicle outside the main entrance before going in. Then she went to find her father. Elliot Hargrove was in his study, as he nearly always was at this hour, behind his desk, reading documents with his glasses on, a cup of tea going cold at his elbow. The portrait of Elena hung on the wall behind him, large and slightly in shadow. He had never taken it down. Sarah had always wondered what that meant. Now she thought she understood. He looked up when she came in. He saw her face. "Sit down, Seraphina. I've been going out," she said. She remained standing. "Every Thursday for 5 weeks. Through the gap in the east wall. I know you probably know. I think you've always known." She watched him. "I met someone." A stillness came over him. Not surprise, exactly. More like a man bracing for something he had always known was coming and had hoped, quietly and without real conviction, might not arrive in his lifetime. "Your people found her," Sarah said. "Didn't they? That's how you've always known where she was. Why she never had a legal case that gained traction." The silence lasted a long time. "I was protecting you," he said finally. "From what? From someone who left. From someone you made it impossible to stay." Her voice didn't rise. She had her mother's quality of stillness when it mattered. "She told me what happened. The families. The land. She told me what she tried to do and what you did to stop her." Elliot removed his glasses. Set them on the desk. He suddenly looked not like the man who claimed rooms when he walked into them but like someone much older and much less certain. "I have made a great deal of money," he said, after a moment. "I have made it in ways that I understood, at the time, to be simply the ways that it was made. I told myself the difference between what I did and what others did was efficiency. Competence. That the outcomes." He stopped. "Were someone else's problem," Sarah said quietly. He didn't deny it. "She wasn't running from you," Sarah said. "She was running from what you were going to do to her if she stayed and told the truth. You made her into the story you needed so you didn't have to be the story that was actually true." The words sat between them. Outside the window, the estate was perfectly still in the way that only maintained things ever are, the silence of a place where nothing is allowed to be uncontrolled. Elliot Hargrove looked at his hands for a long time. When he looked up, something in his face was different. Not collapsed. Not destroyed. Just opened. The way a window is opened in a room that has been closed too long. "What would you have me do?" he said. It was the first time in Sarah's memory that he had ever asked her that question. She had been thinking about it since the clinic. Since Alina's voice, steady and tired and honest. Since Dara's 63 children and the empty lot and the mural in blues and greens and Marcus's careful, evaluating eyes. "Make it right," she said. Not quietly. Not in a way that gets buried in a subsidiary. Make it right in public, where it can't be taken back. What happened next took 3 months to prepare. Sarah was involved in every detail. The legal team was directed to locate, to the extent records allowed, the families displaced by the development 20 years ago, an effort that required dedicated investigators and resulted in 47 verifiable cases, each of which received direct financial remedy calculated not on the original settlement value but on what 2 decades of compounded loss actually represented. The advocacy documentation that Elena had compiled preserved, it emerged, in the possession of a lawyer she had trusted years ago, was reviewed, validated, and incorporated into a public accounting that Elliot Hargrove's communications team did not soften and was not permitted to soften. And on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Elliot Hargrove stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom that was full of journalists and community representatives and people whose names had never appeared in any financial publication but who had received a personal invitation to be present, and he announced the Hargrove Community Foundation, endowed with $1 billion designated for education, healthcare, affordable housing, entrepreneurship support, and community development, governed by an independent board whose chair was a woman named Dara and whose community liaison was a 16-year-old named Marcus, who had recently, at Sarah's suggestion, enrolled in an accelerated academic program and was finding, to his own evident surprise, that he was exceptionally good at it. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not read from prepared remarks. He said that he had spent a long time believing that wealth was protection against pain, and that this belief had caused pain to people who deserved better, and that he was not standing at this podium because he expected to be forgiven but because some debts cannot be paid privately without proving that the privacy itself was always the point. At the back of the room, not seated with the family, not visible from the podium, Elena Vasquez stood near the wall and listened. Sarah found her there afterward. They stood together for a moment, not quite comfortable, not quite strangers. The complicated middle space of 2 people who share something enormous and are only beginning to learn the shape of what it means between them. He meant it, Sarah said. I know, Elena said. I could tell. A pause. It doesn't fix everything, Sarah said. No. Elena's voice was steady. But it's the right place to start. 6 months later, Sarah enrolled in university. Not the offshore program her father had once briefly considered as a controlled alternative, but a real campus in the real city, a 40-minute drive from the estate, where she rented a small flat near the arts building and walked to class through streets she was still learning the names of. She kept the plain jacket. She kept the ordinary shoes. She had developed, over the course of one extraordinary year, a particular habit. Whenever she arrived somewhere new, she would stop for a moment and simply look at the people around her. Not to assess them, not to evaluate whether they could be trusted or what they might want from her. Just to see them. To practice what she had discovered, in the most unexpected school imaginable, was the rarest and most necessary of all human educations, the understanding that the world outside was not what she had been taught to fear. That ordinary people, on ordinary streets, stopped for strangers whose bags had split. That kindness required no audience. That truth, even when it arrived 20 years late, was still worth telling. That walls, however high, however expensive, however carefully maintained, were not protection. They were only distance, and that some distances, no matter how long they had been in place, could still be crossed.